2022 is now underway, and I think that this year, more than others, has a lot of exciting game releases for the SCP universe. Ones that certainly go beyond a 20-minute indie game and try to give us more of a fully fleshed out experience. These projects that have been years in the making are all starting to break forth from the soil and have their time in the light. So in this video, I've been doing some digging, and I'm going to give you an update on what I think are the 12 most notable SCP games for this year, and what they've been getting up to during their development. As always, there will be timestamps in the description below for you to jump ahead to the game that you wish to see. Now, without further ado, let's get started! So first up is SCP Labrat. Now this game doesn't need much of an introduction to my channel, but for everyone else, this game is basically a VR reconstruction of SCP Containment Breach with a bit of a graphical overhaul and a couple of added extras. This game actually released into early access in 2021 and has been receiving small hotfixes at fairly regular intervals throughout the year. But one of the most anticipated features for this game has been multiplayer, and in November of 2021, Bezbro basically put out a post saying that the pressure from the public on multiplayer and the act of doing multiplayer itself was burning them out, and they needed to have a bit of a break from the development. This was of course very disappointing news, but also completely understandable. Multiplayer is by no means an easy thing to implement on a video game, and especially if you've designed it already for a single player setting, it actually takes a lot of work to convert a single player game into a multiplayer one. But apparently none of that mattered anyway, because in December of 2021, just 1 month later, they ended up stealth dropping multiplayer. So some break that was. There we go. So now we have a multiplayer mode, and it is currently in beta. It is available for everyone to download free from Steam, and I believe it will receive the same small hotfix treatment that the single player mode did. So I'm definitely going to be jumping into this one myself, and hopefully there will be some very special guests to join us with that one. But with multiplayer mode out, it probably won't be long now before we see this one leave early access for good. Looking at the most recent of the bunch, we have SCP Nine-Tailed Fox, which has just launched into early access maybe 3 or 4 days before this video. This one is a free-to-play survival horror adaptation of the original SCP Containment Breach, so instead of breaking out of the facility as a D-class, you will instead play as the commander of the Foxtrot Unit 1 Nine-Tailed Fox. Your job is to enter the aftermath of the Containment Breach and recontain the SCPs, avoiding destruction where possible, which is actually a really great touch. Your job will also be to terminate the escaped D-class subjects so they don't spread news of the Foundation's existence or end up recommitting the crimes that got them there in the first place. On top of this, there is also a multiplayer mode, which has MTF vs Chaos Insurgency Team Deathmatch and a PvE Wave Survival mode. In this one, you will fend off against an aggressive strain of SCP-008 infected personnel, or in other words, a bunch of zombies. So yeah, this one definitely looks exciting. I know it's been in the works for a very long time, so it's great to see that they've stuck with it and are now in the release stages of the project. A couple of things to note at the moment: being only a few days old, this game does have its bugs, and I think at the moment there is also no ending to the game. But these things happen with almost every game release, and especially those that release into early access. That's kind of the whole point. But I have a good feeling about this one and very high hopes for what it will become. I think that it puts a great twist on the original SCP Containment Breach experience, and will provide us with a very unique point of view from a game that we already know and love so well. Up next we have SCP Pandemic, and this one looks absolutely stunning. It is a hardcore co-op first-person tactical shooter where you will be infiltrating Area 12 of the SCP Foundation's facilities. In this one, something has happened which has caused the Foundation's core beliefs to change. Previously, it was to secure anomalies, contain them, and then learn about them to protect humanity from the unknown threat. But now, for some reason, this ideology has changed, and they want to suddenly destroy all human life. So your job is to play a rogue fire team to go against the Foundation and attempt to shut down their plans of global omnicide. It looks like you will be able to play up to teams of 4, and from what I've seen, it looks like it's taken a lot of inspiration from GTFO. Only this time it will be a little bit less sneaky and a bit more actiony. Now this one is planned for a release date on February of the 22nd, but there is a backup release of March the 14th in case things get slightly delayed. Now whenever someone puts out a second release date, you probably know that it's going to be a bit more towards the second one than the first one, but you never know. Miracles do happen, so we might see this game in February, but I'm banking on it probably coming out in March. Either way, it looks absolutely stunning, really great graphics, incredible high intensity gameplay, loadout customization. It's going to be great, and I can't wait to get my hands on this one. Another one to keep your eye on is SCP Nucalypse, or should I say SCP Ground Zero. The idea here is that SCP Nucalypse was just way too similar to Containment Breach, so they decided to scrap the name, scrap the game, and now we have SCP Ground Zero. In this one, it seems like you're going to be playing a member of perhaps the Chaos Insurgency, or perhaps just like a private company. Either way, you're going to be infiltrating an SCP facility and attempting to steal SCP-407. SCP-407 has already converted most of the facility into these weird and wonderful plant creatures that chase you down, but you will have access to a large selection of weaponry which will make your time in the facility just that little bit easier. But not much. So it's your job to survive the Foundation's threats, grab the SCP, and get the hell out. Now, we actually played a mini demo here on the channel, and that was taken someplace in the middle of the game. So there's going to be a bit added before this that's going to kind of introduce everything, and then of course the big kind of climax that's added afterwards. It seems like as well as the single player story mode, there's also going to be 4 other individual and unique game modes for the game. Potentially some multiplayer in there, potentially some wave-based stuff. It's all kind of up in the air at the moment, but there's definitely plans for those extra game modes. From what I've played of it, I can say that it's really good. The gameplay, it was incredibly hard, I'll give them that. Perhaps there is some balancing there, but the visuals were just a breath of fresh air. The gameplay was awesome, the animations were on point, everything played and looked beautiful. The sound design was great as well. This one seemed like it had really great quality behind it, and I'm hoping that it does turn out into this kind of lengthy, full-fleshed experience that I'm really hoping that it will be. Next up is SCP Secret Files, where you play as a researcher Carl, who has just been employed by the SCP Foundation. And at this time, they decided that it would be a fantastic idea to assign this new kid to sort out their top secret files. So you begin your days sorting through the files, and as you do so, you will start to read the contents of them. The more you read, the more your perception of the world is meant to change, and the more this will start to affect your mental health. So this game is basically going to be you reading through these top secret files, and each story that you read will take you into a small experience that you will be able to play from a video game perspective. Each story will have its own unique graphical style and gameplay mechanics, and will take you to various locations, from a spooky hydropower plant to driving around a desert tundra. It all seems like a fantastic idea to introduce a bunch of SCPs, whilst also testing out your own development styles, especially for a newer game development team or something similar like that. But it seems really good. This one is also going to have VR support as well, so I'm super excited for that one, and it is planned for early release in 2022, sometime around April-June time. This next one I debated including because there is just so little information about this game, but I was able to get in contact with the developers recently, and suddenly all of that has changed. So this is SCP Missing in Action, which as it stands has just a single video on YouTube showcasing the game's development. In this video, you take on the perspective of Jackal, who is being visited by SCP-990 inside of a dream sequence. SCP-990 basically proposes a deal to you to do something that he won't even tell you about in exchange for information about the SCP Foundation. The character you are playing is obviously very desperate, so he signs the contract and then SCP-990 leaves. And that's basically it. Whilst doing some extra digging, I was also very surprised to find out that this is actually planned as a free-to-play, open-world third-person survival game set in the SCP universe. Now that sounds incredibly ambitious, and with nothing but rumours to go on, it's hard to see if this game was actually ever going to be made. That was until now. Since contacting the developers, I now realise that this game is very much alive and very much possible. What you are seeing on the screen now is an image from their website that is currently in development. You can actually visit this using the link in the description below, and it will give you a bit of a background on what this game is about. From this information, I can say that in this game, an SCP facility will get raided by the Global Occult Coalition, or GOC, and several SCPs are going to be stolen. Mobile Task Force Theta-17 will be sent into the Latinus mountain range, where the game will take place, to assist in retrieving the stolen SCPs. But something inevitably will go horribly wrong, and the team are ambushed, leaving soldiers Jackal and Sickle trapped behind enemy lines and declared dead. The two are now forced to fight against a range of otherworldly creatures and to side with some unlikely allies to be able to reassemble their squad, regain contact with the SCP Foundation, and escape with their lives. Some of the entities confirmed for this include SCP-1320, known as the Environmentalist Refractive Explorers, SCP-3560, known as the Anarchic Undead Robots, and SCP-3456, known as the Barbaric Orcadian Horsemen. Now, if that doesn't sound like the most amazing time ever, then I don't know what does. And to top it all off, we're going to end with an exclusive look at some of the early environment work, along with some of the creatures, and a sneak peek at our playable character. In the background, what you will hear is an unreleased soundtrack for the game, which presumably will be played during a battle segment, or rather epic cutscene. This next one is another one that we might see come out of early access by the end of the year, which is SCP Blackout. Basically, for those who don't know this game, it is a single-player survival horror game that can be played in either PC or VR, where you play as a D-class amidst a containment breach. Sound familiar? Well, this time, however, you are inside Site 50, which is like a post office for SCPs. SCPs will come in and will get designated names and classifications, then sent off to other facilities across the world for further testing. Only this time, the SCPs have been completely designed from the ground up for the purpose of the game. So you won't see these SCPs anywhere else, and they all have their own unique mechanics. Now, last year of October, I think it was, we had a humongous patch for this game. It implemented, I think, 3 times more content, we had new SCPs, we had many more environments, and a huge story rework. The introduction of a new main antagonist Zero was, I think, one of the main focal points of this patch. So we had some really exciting zones and a lot of interesting gameplay that kind of pushed the game along, but this only affected the end half of the game. So we are still waiting for an update on the first half. Now, since the time after October, the developers have formed their own video game studio, which is known as the Classified X. And in that time, they have been developing their own flagship game to kind of launch off the company, which was called Going the Distance. It's basically like this launcher game where you control a paper aeroplane in a 2D space, but it's got some horror elements thrown in there as you go along. It's actually kind of an interesting concept, and one that looks like it would do quite well. But in the beginning of 2022, the lead developer put out a post that basically said they are now back working on SCP Blackout to finish off the beginning half of the game. We haven't heard much since then, but on the 27th of January, we got a post from the developers on social media that teased this little intro sequence here. So you can see that the map has definitely had a lot of work done and a fresh coat of paint, and it's looking good. So I'm super looking forward to this one. I think it was the first game I ever played on YouTube, so I'm really hoping that we get to see this one come out by the end of the year. That, for me, would be really exciting. Taking inspiration from SCP's Secret Lab this time, we have SCP Forgotten Facility. This one is described as a 20th century World War II era horror game that revolves around the SCP universe. It will be a primarily multiplayer focused game with a single player campaign in the works. Very similar to Secret Lab, you will basically play a bunch of different classes, you'll be able to play the SCPs too, and you'll all have your own various roles and victory conditions. It looks like there's going to be 15 interactable SCP objects scattered about the map, and also 10 weapons that you will be able to use to carry out your objectives. Later on, there is a single player campaign planned, where you will be playing a kind of multiple perspective, multiple role story. There is a D-class member, an Axis Forces member, and a member of the Allied Forces. The idea is that this will be a 6-chapter story mode, where you will play each person's perspective throughout. This one was planned for a release in 2021, but it was slightly delayed, so we might see it this year or we might hear something later on in the year that will tell us that it has been delayed further. Either way, it's one to keep your eye on and it looks interesting enough. I like the style of it, I like the fact that it's in this World War II horror game setting, that might put a cool perspective on some of the guns that we get to use, and yeah, I'll be excited to see what SCPs come out for this one as well. Another one that is scheduled for this year is SCP Observer. Now, just looking at this from first principles, it does look very similar to a Five Nights at Freddy's meets SCP clone. And from its description, it says that you are trapped in a security room and you must monitor the camera system for threats and manage the power carefully to survive. That all sounds very similar to Five Nights at Freddy's, but I think with an SCP skin on it, it could be quite fun. Some of the SCPs that have been confirmed so far are SCP-049, SCP-079, 939, 966, 035, 173, and 3199. So there's a couple of familiar ones in there, but it also looks like there'll be some new ones as well. Now, we don't have much information about this game other than a couple of screenshots, but the idea is that there will be a trailer out soon, which in it will contain a release date. So we might see it at the end of this year, or it could be announced for maybe early next year, or a sort of mid-next year time. Either way, coming soon, and looks like a fun arcade game to introduce people to the SCP world. One that caused a huge stir last year was the new take on SCP-3008 with The Store is Closed. Since Lone Survivor was abandoned, we were all feeling just a little bit bummed out regarding the Infinite IKEA, but last year we got the announcement of The Store is Closed, which is a brand new SCP-3008 game that has a lot of incredible features and opens up a lot of potential for this game. We've got these kind of like sky bases that you'll be able to explore, then there's these SCP underground bases that you will also be able to explore. It's got a fully fledged crafting system that is very similar to the forest, and of course there is also the survival mechanics of surviving off of food and avoiding the various classes that will be implemented from the 3008 staff. On top of this, there is also multiplayer, and there are these boss battles every now and then, where these managers will come out after you've kind of caused enough mayhem in the store, and they will try to stop you in various waves. I think there's planned to have multiple different variations of the managers appear throughout the story, and at the end you will then face off against the biggest nasty of all. Now, since its announcement, the game got released on Patreon, and it was able to be played in a very early beta mode. Now, this mode didn't have any of the sky bases, nor did it have any of the underground facilities, but it did have all of the crafting system and included a couple of classes from the 3008 staff members as well. One of the major drawbacks with this is that there was no saving mode, so we weren't able to make any substantial progress with the game. So we've all been kind of like anticipating these regular hotfixes or mini additions to the game. But it's been a few months now, and we haven't heard anything. It's been very dark for quite a while now, and a lot of people have taken to contacting the team over social media. But even then, there's been very little reply. Now, the staff members from the Discord do assure us that the game is being worked on, and it will receive an update soon. But with no word from Ziggy himself, it's getting harder and harder to hold faith with this one. So I just hope that we do see something soon, or at least we hear from the developer himself. Because we've all seen this one before with Lone Survivor, and we really don't want it to happen to this one. So, let us know that you're out there. Times might be tough, you might not have what you hoped for, but let us know that you're here, let us know that you still want to work on this game, and we will be with you every step of the way. Up next is SCP Recontainment. Now, if you ever wanted to kind of squish every SCP game that was ever made into one single game, that is exactly what SCP Recontainment is. It is this massive ambition project where they hope to include just so many game modes, both single player and multiplayer, and just mash it all together into this one giant megamix orange box style game. Inside of that is meant to include the original Containment Breach experience that will also have a multiplayer mode of up to 30 players. So if you ever wanted to go through Containment Breach with your entire class, then now you can go and do so. There's also going to be some single player experiences. There's like an 087 experience, very similar to kind of the original Stairway experience. You'll be able to perform some SCP experiments on various SCPs. There'll be these kind of like SCP termination missions where you will go in and try to kill the SCP. I know one of them planned at the moment seems to be 096, and all I can say to that is good luck. And there will be these initial containment experiences where you will go out into the world, try to locate the SCP, and then kind of capture it and bring it back to the Foundation. All in potentially single player and multiplayer modes. There's just a lot happening in this game for sure. Now, a post came out this year that says that the game has slowed down a little bit from a full-time project to a part-time one, but they do plan to get all of the initial game modes that have been planned already ready for the public early access build, which I hope that we'll be able to see this year. They've kind of investigated VR as a supported technology for the game, but most likely it seems like this will be out on PC first, and then the VR update will come later, if at all. Either way, this has planned over 40 SCPs, 5 types of game modes, and of course the mixture between single player and multiplayer experiences. Absolutely ginormous ambitious project. I wish you all the luck with that one, but I am forever excited to see what becomes of this one. Another phenomenal looking ambition project is SCP Fragmented Minds. This one is shaping up to be borderline AAA quality, and it looks mind-blowingly good. There's no real teaser for this game yet, so I'll put up a bit of a compilation from all of the art and teaser videos that I've managed to find on this. But basically this one takes place in Site 113, and it's on Mars, which is defined as the most advanced off-world facility. In this one, you will awaken from hypersleep to a containment breach where you will need to survive the escaped SCPs, piece together what has happened during the long sleep, and eventually come up with your own solution to fix the problem. Now, this one has multiple branching story paths. I can quote this one. It says, "Who or what you will find in the facility will ultimately determine your fate." There will be some classic and some brand new SCPs with their own unique appearance and interactions, all completely redesigned from the ground up for this game. Looking at some of these pictures, there's going to be like these human survival camps that are left within the facility that will have a bunch of NPCs that you will be able to talk to. You will also be able to interact with some SCP characters. They've mentioned that some of them that were previously portrayed as malicious will now be interactable, so we might be talking to 049 or 106, you never really know. There's going to be platforming, puzzle solving, there's an option for stealth gameplay or combat. This game really has it all, and it looks incredibly exciting. There's also going to be a complete multiplayer section to the game. One of those teased has been a hunt game mode, where you and your team will basically look to contain and destroy SCPs from around the world. You'll be able to load up with your own custom gear and weapons, and then basically deploy, find, and terminate the SCP. The SCPs themselves will also be fully playable, similar to Secret Laboratory style, and their aim will be to try and stop the MTF units that are trying to destroy them in the first place. Other game modes are planned, such as Capture the Flag, Team Deathmatch, all of that good stuff, and yeah, this one looks genuinely amazing. Super hyped for this one. The demo for this game seems to be released on March the 12th, or at least that's what has been planned from their timeline, so let's hope that we get to see this one in March. So that was my 12 most notable SCP games for 2022. Now, as seems to be a bit typical with SCP games, they have this little bit of a habit of kind of cancelling mid-development, so I really hope that the games that I have listed today have the ambition and the drive that's needed to see them through to their end. I think that a lot of them, especially kind of like SCP Pandemic, SCP Fragmented Minds, and of course Labrat, Blackout, Ground Zero, all of those seem like they have definitely rooted their place in the SCP world and are definitely coming. Some of the other ones maybe seem a bit more abstract, but I really hope that we do get to see all of these, and I hope that they are as exciting as they all seem to be. So thank you very much for watching. Let me know down below which of these are your kind of most favourites, which ones you're most hyped for, and other than that, I will see you all in the next time. So until then, goodbye!